From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Andy Burnham is back in London and edging closer and closer to moving into Downing Street. One of the current residents is keen.
I'm backing Andy Burnham to be our next Prime Minister. I've known Andy for, 16, 17 years now. He's a good friend of mine.
I'm not sure it'll spare her eviction, though. As this one-man leadership election rumbles on, there is non-stop talk of who will replace Rachel Reeves and what Andy Burnham will actually do with our sluggish economy, what he'll do with Rachel Reeves' own policies.
Remind us what the fiscal rules are.
I'm not going to go through a discussion like an exam on the fiscal rules.
Why
I know
not?
what the fiscal rules are. We will set out a plan that is within those rules so that we keep the discipline. Nothing I've said at any point in this campaign or before this campaign has been about ignoring the bond markets. Or saying
Andy Burnham has what he calls a generational devolution plan. Seems like you really can't take the boy out of Manchester.
How do we move this country away from, the short-termism of Westminster and the battles that the Whitehall departments have to a different approach, which is about a more productive state, a more growth-enabling state. And to me, this implies quite significant culture change within Whitehall, and particularly Whitehall finally fully embracing the devolution agenda.
As Andy Burnham takes to the stage this week to add a bit more flesh to those thin policy bones, we will look at what he could do and what many are pushing him to do, like killing the triple lock on pensions.
If Andy indicated credibly he was going to deal with welfare reform, taking on the triple lock, which I know Andy has said so far that he wouldn't, then the markets would embrace it.
The story today, Burnham versus the economy.
I'm Jack Barnett, economics correspondent for The Times for nearly 3 years.
A lot of schmoozing in your job? Do you do that a lot? Or is it just sort of like Bloomberg terminals and...
A little bit. There is a bit of schmoozing, obviously, in the city. I don't think there's as much schmoozing in the city as there was 20 years ago when people were going for lunch for about 6 hours and sinking about 6 pints. But
yeah, you missed the golden age.
I did miss the golden age, sadly. But I have been today over in Westminster speaking to someone who's sort of Burnham adjacent, kind of around the Burnham camp. And then, I think there is a lot of optimism around those people. It's obviously not just him. I've spoken to a couple of people close to Miliband's people, a couple of people that I know around in Manchester who've worked in local authorities as well, speaking to some of them. There is a lot of optimism. They sort of think that this is, he could be their guy to push forward this long-term agenda and this sort of break from the past that the British economy has been having for some time. What he's going to go back to and what's going to determine a lot of the policy outlook is who he chooses as Chancellor. That is going to be crucial for all of this.
And I guess as well now trying to plug into what Team Burnham and himself might do when he descends. Before we get into any details, I mean, sort of how easy or difficult has that been?
It's tough. I think defining what Manchesterism is, which is obviously the sort of name given to this Burnham-type philosophy of nearly 10 years of his mayorship in Manchester. It's difficult. I think even the sort of wonks in Westminster, the think tanks, are even struggling to sort of really pen down exactly what the economic strategy is. But there are quite obvious examples of the direction he might go in. Obviously, the B network in Manchester, the bus network, which he's brought back into state control, is quite a clear example of the direction he wants to go in. But it will depend on when he puts the flesh on the bones in the coming weeks. Obviously, when he does probably almost inevitably become Prime Minister, I think that's when we'll get the real sort of meat there and we'll understand where he wants to go.
We've long been told that you can't remove Rachel Reeves as Chancellor because the bond market will have a heart attack. We had a slight flavour of that when she appeared last summer on the benches behind Keir Starmer in the House of Commons, eyes heavy with tears. Have you sensed any nervousness now? The sort of assumption is that she won't make it in a Burnham government at that level.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the sort of working assumption in the city and also in Westminster is that she's not going to last long at all underneath a Burnham premiership. I think the bond market, I mean, if you just look at what's been happening in terms of the yields on UK bonds this year, they've taken it in their stride.
And these are the people that hold and trade government debt.
That's right. That's correct. Obviously, these are the people that we do need to go to when we want to go and invest in things like social housing, which Andy Burnham's very keen on. But the market is, really has taken it in stride. Since the local elections at the beginning of May, the yield on the 10-year UK bond, which is sort of the benchmark of our borrowing cost, is down quite sharply. It's down, I think, around about 0.1 percentage points. When you compare that to German yields, which is the sort of European benchmark, and also American bond yields, we've had quite a big decline over the last month. Now, some people have said that is tied to the fact that after Sir Keir Starmer announced his resignation as Prime Minister, Wes Streeting very quickly quashed the reports that he was going to lead and challenge Burnham for a leadership. So that sort of took away the risk that we were going to get a whole summer of hustings and, Burnham tabling policies that may not particularly go down with the market. Same with Wes Streeting. So I think markets responded quite well to the fact that it looks as if we're going to get a coronation. It's going to be done pretty quickly by the middle of July. I think potentially what has been the bigger driver for the drop in yields.
And we should say a drop in yields is good.
A drop in yields is very good.
Exactly,
That'd be welcome by everybody. It makes the government's spending plans a lot more palatable. I think one of they're both working in tandem, but there's certainly another one of the drivers is that we are quite plainly obviously getting closer to a lasting ceasefire in the Middle East. There's obviously been this memorandum of understanding that's just about holding. A lot more ships have been passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last week or so. And the oil price, if you just take Brent crude, which is obviously the international benchmark, the oil price is actually below levels as it was before the war. Now that pushes down, inflation fears, reduces the chance of central banks raising interest rates. The bond markets reacted to that.
Yet to make it to the pumps, but...
Yet to make it to the pumps.
Otherwise, good.
A lot of the time, the petrol suppliers are very quick to raise rates, but not drop them.
You mentioned this theory of Manchesterism, which has been applied to Andy Burnham's thinking. And you mentioned part of that is, what he's done with the bus network and how even some of the wonks are struggling with this. You're the only wonk in this room at the moment. So how are you grappling with it? How would you explain it to somebody?
First and foremost, you've got to compare it to what we've had over the last 2 years in terms of an economic strategy underneath Sir Keir Starmer. Now, I think from the economic side, forget the politics. Lots of people were saying that. There just was never this overarching strategy, a narrative, no way of being able to explain it to the country what they're specifically trying to do. It was very much a continuation of what had come probably since the 2008 financial crisis. I think there were two prongs by which Rachel Reeves and Starmer tried to sort of mould the economy in their image. The first one was, and if you look at this over the course of the two budgets that Rachel Reeves did, if you forget some of the spring statements, one of the main pillars of their strategy was to really raise public investment spending. There was a really, really big drive to do that. She tweaked some of the fiscal rules to allow the government to borrow more, to invest in the economy. I think it's something around about, it's getting close to £100 billion worth of public investment spending increase relative to previous plans. So that was definitely one of the big pillars of the strategy. And I think Burnham, given, the B network, which he's launched in Manchester, he's obviously talking a lot about bringing some of public utilities back into state control, maybe not state ownership, but state control. That will almost certainly, that trend of increasing public investment will probably continue underneath Burnham.
And just to explain that qualifier there, because what's the difference necessarily between state ownership and state control?
So state control is basically the end user, so the consumer. The government is able to basically have more control over the price which is actually given to that consumer at the end of it. State ownership is you just own all the assets of that company itself. Some would argue you kind of get to the same point anyway. If you own all the assets that say Thames Water, you own Thames Water, or you can then set the price of what a Thames Water type government company would be able to charge consumers. So I think it's basically just making sure that the company which operates the service charges a fair price to consumers and also provides services which not necessarily private companies might do. So the B network is a very good example of that, where it's introduced new routes in Manchester and it's obviously capped prices at a much lower level as to what they were before. And it's a very good example where Burnham might potentially go in that sort of corridor of uncertainty between, does the government just nationalise large parts of the economy, or does it get more involved in the market, introduce a bit more influence in the market to then raise competition itself in the market?
And what can we glean from people who are already announced as being part of Burnham's either team or there as advisors about what kind of a direction other parts he might be going?
I think he is certainly trying to bat away these allegations that he's going to be fiscally loose, he's going to borrow loads of money, it's going to cause absolute havoc in the bond market. With some of the reports that we've got of people who are advising behind closed doors, so you've got Richard Hughes, who was obviously the previous head of the Office of Budget Responsibility. He's been involved in some of the policy work there. Andy Haldane, former chief economist at the Bank of England for a long time, very well respected in the city. He's also now at the British Chambers of Commerce. And Lord Jim O'Neill, former chief economist at Goldman Sachs. So some pretty heavy hitters who have been around both Westminster and the city for a long period of time. So I think what he's trying to do there is really put forward a credible package towards, some people who might say, well, he might be taking advice from some unconventional people. And I think part of the reasoning behind that is he probably wants to assure the bond markets, because they don't want to get too jittery, because at the moment it's still, yields have come down in the last couple of weeks. Our borrowing costs are much higher than they were compared to 3 or 4 years ago.
That could be, if you listen to some ministers briefing to our political colleagues on the paper, all thrown off kilter if Ed Miliband is made Chancellor. Yeah. Lots of them briefing saying, he's going to take things he's so not pro-business that all what you said there would just be undone. Do you think that's the case?
It's potentially. I mean, what is difficult to say is when you don't know the policy outlook, it's very, very hard to then judge it. So all you can do is obviously look at previous work that ministers have done. So, Miliband has obviously been involved in the energy strategy for the entirety of Starmer's government. He's one of the very few cabinet ministers, who's been there the entire time. He's really well across his brief. I mean, he does know it inside out. I think some people would say he might be a bit too hard-nosed on the net zero green transition stuff.
Clean energy offers our best chance to escape the high energy bills that have caused the cost of living crisis. We're at the mercy of the petrostates and dictators, and the only way out of it is our mission for clean power by 2030.
Some people I certainly know who are close to Burnham have expressed some reservations about how quickly they're trying to go on that stuff.
He was the person who originally wanted, £28 billion every year spent in green infrastructure spending.
Yes, he was. To be fair, I mean, underneath Rachel Reeves with this new public investment drive, they are kind of sort of at that figure now, and not necessarily going all into green investment, but they have, I mean, like I said, they have been putting a lot of money into public investment over the last couple of years. But I think in terms of how would the bond market react to an Ed Miliband chancellorship, what the bond market is basically concerned about is inflation. That's the only thing the bond market really cares about, because when there's high inflation, it erodes the returns they get from holding that bond. It also means if we have high inflation, it makes it more like the Bank of England is going to raise interest rates. The bond market reacts to that by pushing up yields. Underneath an Ed Miliband chancellorship, what would we likely to get? Potentially more borrowing, maybe a bit more government spending. But there is a clear strategy there to tackle some of the underlying factors in the economy which make us really susceptible to inflation, one of which is our energy structure. We are really exposed to the price of imported natural gas. That's been the main driver of inflation. If Miliband can put forward a credible plan to wean us off those structurally deficient parts of the economy, i.e. the energy system, which makes inflation higher in the UK, the bond market might be absolutely fine with that. But, I speak to bond traders a lot, and what they always say to me is that we don't mind if the government borrows, and we're absolutely fine with that. It's just as long as it's credible and we know it's going to push up growth and we know it's going to tackle inflationary problems. And, if Miliband can do that underneath his chancellorship, or Wes Streeter can do that, the bond market will be fine with it.
Well, there are two things they'll have to do then. They might have to borrow more, but also they might have to cut spending in certain parts. And there is one sort of policy idea floating around, as it has for a while, which has got people talking, might stoke generational war. Jack, we're talking about what might be in all of our future as Andy Burnham becomes Prime Minister, particularly on the economic front. You were just explaining some of what could be his approach to things when he finally takes office, if that obviously does happen, which it seems very likely it will. In terms of hard policies, I keep hearing people say, well, you should scrap this triple lock. If you're after cash down the side of the sofa and you're saying already that you're not going to raise income tax, you're not going to raise VAT and all the rest of it, this is one of the places you can go. What is the triple lock, first of all, and why is it so expensive?
So the triple lock was brought in 2010 underneath George Osborne and David Cameron during their Conservative government.
Now pensioners can say with confidence, they will also be protected by our new triple lock, which will guarantee each and every year a rise in the basic state pension in line with earnings, prices, or a 2.5% increase, whichever is the greater.
The provision that we got underneath the state pension at the time was relatively quite bad compared to our OECD sort of rich country peers. So it was brought in to address that problem. Basically, it means the state pension increases by whichever is highest out of earnings, inflation, and 2.5% every year. You know, over the last couple of years, inflation has been really high, particularly after Russia's invasion in Ukraine. I think, inflation was 11.1% in October 22, it's highest for 40 years. So basically, the policy is designed to protect pensioners' living standards. So, when you've got an increase in prices, your living standards go down if your income doesn't keep pace with that. Obviously, if pensioners are getting an 11% increase in their pension when inflation is 11%, they should be fine. What we've had over the last couple of years, which wasn't factored into when the policy was made in 2010, is that we've had a really quite sharp return in inflation the last 5 years. I think prices compared to 2021 are up around, I think it's nearly a third, which is pretty sharp. And you can obviously see why people were constantly talking about the cost of living, because that has not happened for a long time, probably since the 1980s. So it was there to address existing lack of resources in pension provision, but it wasn't designed at a time when inflation was a real problem. So, Burnham said it before, he always wants to look at it. Lots of people in the city and lots of people in Westminster in think tanks there's this consensus kind of forming around the fact that they don't think it's actually a very good policy anymore.
Because it's just too expensive.
It is expensive. It's very expensive. I mean, if you look at all government welfare spending, so every single benefit that the government gives out to young people, to unemployed people, to old people, I think pensioners get about 55% of all that in total. And that has gone up a lot since the introduction of the triple lock. So it's definitely an area which, Burnham said he's going to look at it already. It's definitely an area which they can potentially get some money out of as well.
And has it made pensioners better off? So actually, if you were to sort of try and nibble away at this policy, you could make an argument that, well, you're already sitting on more cash than you otherwise would be.
Yeah, that pensioners are undoubtedly better off from where they were when it was first introduced. Our pensioner poverty rate has gone down quite a bit since we introduced it. And obviously that means, the policy has been a success. If your main aim was to drive down pensioner poverty and increase pensioner welfare, triple lock's been brilliant. It's been absolutely great for them. But I suppose the main criticism that economists and people will say is that, at what point do you get to when you say, okay, we've addressed that issue now. There are more pressing issues that we need to dedicate our resources to, one of which is defence spending. NHS is consistently always hoovering up money. And we've got a really big problem with youth unemployment in this country right now, which potentially government resources may be better spent there.
But it's not like you're ever going to claw back this money or massively cut it. It's just sort of about trimming the rate at which it grows, surely. So what would be, if you were to scrap the triple lock, as they say, what would that actually be and how much would you actually save?
So there's been a couple of proposals from a few think tanks, one of which from the Resolution Foundation, where they basically said what you can do, you can sort of smooth the edges of how much the state pension increases underneath every single year. What they're basically saying is that just tie it to earnings every single year, get rid of the sort of inflation element, just keep it to earnings. That means that, when the rest of the country's average earnings are increasing at X percent, the pensioners are not left behind, because the way we measure poverty in this country is how much your income is relative to the national average. So if you just increase it in line with earnings, pensioner poverty rates should broadly stay similar. That will save you a bit. I think the Resolution Foundation estimated that if you provided it underneath that mechanism since 2012, up until now would have saved, I think it's about £10 billion. So that's
Not to be sniffed at.
Not to be sniffed at all.
Yeah.
But, we are looking at some quite substantial increases over the coming years. I mean, the OBR's forecast that state pension spending is going to go up tens of billions of pounds underneath the current mechanism. So, pensioners have had a pretty good deal of it in the last 15 years.
There is, we're saying that as two very young men, though.
That's very
Careful.
true.
Because they do, if they ever talk about changing pensions, or if you're talking about, lots of other areas of government policy which affect pensioners, there is always quite a sharp backlash. And even particularly on that point you said there about, why not just tie it to earnings? People defending the triple lock would always say, well, if your earnings aren't, going fabulously well as a worker, you can choose to work more. Whereas if you're a pensioner, you can't necessarily do that to top up. So you'd still have a fight, whatever you did. It's a politically tricky area.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, obviously pensioners are a huge, we shouldn't try to reduce people to sort of voting blocks, but they are big. They are a big voting block. And obviously, if they're going to look to recalibrate how the triple op operates, it's obviously going to annoy a lot of people. But I think there is this consensus forming, not just amongst sort of wonks and think tankers. I think quite a lot of pensioners as well are also sort of coming around to the idea that we've had some pretty good increases in the pension over the last 15 years. And, there are probably other areas which is becoming more pressing in terms of the government agenda. I've obviously mentioned defence spending there.
Yeah. But also you do sometimes hear in focus groups and as reporting where you hear, people aren't necessarily voting just for explicitly selfish reasons as it pertains to their own balance sheet. Pensioners will have grandchildren who they see struggling to rent or get on the housing ladder, or parents see that about their children. So I could think they maybe can see the wider picture beyond just their own pocket.
Yeah, of course. And also, I obviously mentioned youth unemployment. Nearly 1 in 5 people in this country who are beneath the ages of 16 to 24 are unemployed. If we can save a bit of money at the top end of the age distribution and then reinvest that into the bottom end, that is a very good investment. I mean, there's very few things in the economy that you can invest in and get a better return on than investing in young people, getting them into work, creating educational pathways, boosting skills, particularly at a time when you've got artificial intelligence completely recalibrating the labour market. I think that is a pretty good sell for pensioners.
That is just one area that Andy Burnham might tinker with, and it could, as you said there, raise a bit of money. But as you were just comparing over the lifetime of the policy, it might just be in the sort of 10 billion kind of mark. How many levers are there, thinking more broadly, that Andy Burnham can actually pull on, or his Chancellor could pull on, to actually help shift spending around in a meaningful way and put the money into, we're recording it during a heat wave where people are talking about the lack of infrastructure spending going into schools and their ability to have aircon, or the defence investment plan that you mentioned there. I mean, thinking about everything he's already ruled out, are there many?
It's tough. It is tough. I mean, from my perspective, I think what he needs immediately, even before the autumn budget, is he needs very quick policy wins, particularly on the cost of living. I don't think he's going to have a lot of time to keep the momentum when he first gets in, because people will be looking at him as a real sort of breakaway from the last 2 years of diva, U-turns, some quite stingy policies directed towards traditional Labour voting blocks. I think immediate things that he could, if you look at what has driven the cost of living in the last couple of years, it's been energy primarily, and it's been food. They're the two things. Now,
eat out to help out.
Is
that what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
Government vouchers for Nando's.
I mean, that was a disaster. But I think there's a couple of things he could do on energy bills. He could potentially look at how frequently Ofgem changes the price cap. There's been a big reduction in oil prices, obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, how quickly that feeds into the price cap. He could do that. He could put pressure on petrol retailers to drop their petrol prices quicker in order to reflect the wholesale oil market. But obviously a lot of this stuff is going to be the sort of big package, the meaty policies. They're not going to come until the autumn budget. We sort of talk about what is the big direction of Manchester's and what is the big picture of this government. I think what Burnham is trying to do is less so these sort of consumery policy type things where they tweak the fuel duty, or they give people a couple £100 to spend on some air conditioning or something. I think he will look at this as big picture, long-term structural change to change the economy so it's less susceptible to inflation. And I think that means things of investing in the energy infrastructure via the state, potentially looking at state ownership or state control over public utilities. Obviously, Thames Water is a prime example of that. I think that's the direction that we're going in, but we're not really going to get the actual cost, what they're going to do, where the investments are going to go until that autumn budget. And then he's got this vacuum period of about, 4 or 5 months until we get to that budget.
But just finally, we've also then got an enormous lag to the point at which anyone might feel the benefit of any of those policies if it works. And we're already talking now about how quickly political journalists and political news consumers would like to see results and are impatient and on to the next thing. Is that the same in your world? Do you think people are less willing to go along with a plan that actually, especially if you're talking about energy, might take 5, might take 10 years to bear fruit?
I mean, in the economics world, there is a much longer term view compared to there's this public choice theory. So it's this paradox whereby politicians they have no incentive to think about the long term because obviously they operate in 5-year election cycles, right? So that's why we get industrial strategies seemingly every 6 months and then nothing actually comes to fruition. In economics, they will look at the long term. So I was sort of casting my mind back 3 years ago when we were getting towards the dregs of the Tory government. And every single economist in my inbox, from the Institute for Fiscal Studies to the Resolution Foundation, to all these sort of like high and mighty think tanks everywhere, the one thing they consistently always said they just want the government to do is raise investment spending. Because for a long time in this country, and it is plainly true since the 2008 financial crisis, Britain has not invested in itself. That is just true. If you look across the world, across our peers, we lag behind every single indicator. And, arguably, we are now paying the consequence for that. For instance, you mentioned schools there in this heat. That is something that we could have addressed when interest rates were 0% after the COVID financial crisis, where they're obviously not there anymore. So I think that is where it will be going. That is hopefully what a lot of economists want this government to do, and what every government to do is to raise investment spending and keep it at that level in order to regenerate the economy. But as I mentioned, politicians never have the luxury of the 10, 15, 20-year view that the Institute for Fiscal Studies takes, because they know voters want quick results. And particularly in this environment now, voters are, they are really struggling with the cost of living. They really are. That's plainly true. And if Burnham can do something on the consumer front which helps that slightly in the first couple of months, I think people will appreciate that. I think that's the way that he can maintain the momentum, is if he does give them some consumery policies and then really, sort of look to the long term at the first budget in autumn.
Jack, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
Jack Barnett, economics correspondent for The Times. The story at thetimes.com is our email address. I'm sure you've got views on this. Maybe you are the recipient of a state pension, or maybe you're someone very much younger than that thinking, yes, trim that triple lock. Let us know. The producer today was Harry Stott. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design was by Ivan Eastley, and theme composition was by Mao Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.